Wet wool smells like nothing until it's trapped in a coat closet with a dead man's jacket still warm on the hanger, and then it smells like the last 90 seconds of somebody's life. 14 of the city's most protected men stood shoulder to shoulder in a private dining room with the doors locked from the inside, and not one of them could say who had done it. The boss of that room had looked at a girl in a black polyester vest whose name he'd never once bothered to learn and told her, in front of everyone, that she didn't belong there. 90 seconds later, he'd have given anything he owned to have asked her opinion first. It wasn't an accusation, it was a coat ticket. Rain smelled different on Ludlow Street than anywhere else in the city. Nora Kessler had decided a long time ago. Thinner, meaner, laced with the particular exhaust and fry oil funk of a block that had 4 restaurants and no trees. That smell was the first 11 minutes of her day, every day. The walk from the L train to the service door of a private supper club called the Aurelian. And by the time she reached that door, her sneakers were always wet through to the sock. She was 29. She had been 29 for what felt like 9 years running, the way certain ages just refuse to let go, once the body underneath them stops sleeping enough. Nora smelled like drugstore rose water. The $3 roll-on, not the $11 spray, because the spray lasted longer, but the roll-on didn't require her to choose between perfume and bus fare on a Tuesday. Layered over the mothball and wet wool smell that lived permanently in the fabric of her coat check vest, no matter how many times she washed it. Her hands told a different story than her face did. Calluses across both palms from hanging 400 coats a night on a rolling rack built for 200, and a burn scar the size of a dime on her left wrist from the time a rack of hangers had slipped and a curling iron someone had left in a coat pocket had done what curling irons do. The Aurelian sat behind an unmarked black door 2 blocks off the avenue, a private supper club that didn't take reservations so much as approve applications, where a 7-course tasting menu ran $400 a head before the wine and the coat check was staffed by exactly 1 person, because the owner, a man named Vittorio Cassano, had said so, once, within earshot, that a second coat check girl was an unnecessary expense for a job any competent person could do alone. Nora was that competent person. She had been for 3 years. In 3 years, Vittorio Cassano had spoken to her directly exactly 4 times, and 2 of those times had been to tell her the temperature in the coat room was making the wine list smell like damp cashmere, as though the temperature was something she controlled and not something the building's ancient radiator system controlled entirely on its own schedule. Rent on her studio in Bushwick was $1,650. She had $1,090. She had counted it 3 times that week already, on 3 different trains. The way you count money, you don't trust yourself to have counted correctly the first time. The gap was $460. Her landlord wasn't a monster. He was a man named Delgado, who owned 6 buildings, and answered to a management company that didn't know her name any better than Vittorio Cassano did, and management companies did not extend Fridays the way tired individual men sometimes could. She had until the 5th. The 5th was 6 days out. She worked the Aurelian 4 nights a week, 6 p.m. to close, cash tips folded into a rubber band she kept in her bra because a purse in a coat closet was an invitation, and the other 3 nights she worked the counter at a 24-hour pharmacy on Delancey, ringing up cold medicine and lottery tickets under lights so bright they gave her headaches by hour 4. Between the 2 jobs she cleared, most weeks, $2,240 before taxes, and taxes were a thing she paid in full because a woman 2 jobs deep in cash work could not afford to also be a woman with a problem on paper. She had one hobby, and it was the only hour of any day that belonged to her alone. She read faces. Not palm reading, not anything with a shingle hung over a storefront window. She'd taught herself, starting at 19, off library books on micro-expressions and forensic interview technique that she'd checked out under a fake sense of purpose, telling herself she was going to become a behavioral analyst someday, the way you tell yourself things at 19. She'd never become anything. She'd become a woman who hung 400 coats a night and, in the dead 15 minutes between the entree course and dessert, when nobody needed anything checked or retrieved, watched the security monitor bolted above the coat room door and read the faces of 140 men in tuxedos the way other people read the sports page. Not because she cared, but because the grid was there, and her brain, for reasons she'd never fully forgiven it for, needed a grid to hold. She was good at it in a way no one who mattered had ever once complimented, because no one who mattered had ever once watched her do it on purpose. Her apartment was 310 square feet above a bodega that ran its walk-in freezer compressor 22 hours a day. A low mechanical hum she'd stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. Present always, audible only in the rare dead silence when the compressor briefly cycled off. She had a mattress on a metal frame, no headboard, a hot plate instead of a stove because the actual stove had died the winter before, and Delgado's management company kept saying, "We'll send someone," the way companies say things they've scheduled themselves to forget. And a cat named Radish, who ate the store-brand kibble with chicken, listed fourth on the ingredients, and corn listed first, because the vet-recommended bag was $38 and the other bag was $11, and Radish did not know the difference, and most months, neither did Nora's bank account. She owned 2 black button-down shirts and rotated them the way you rotate anything irreplaceable, carefully, checking each morning which one smelled less like fry oil from the pharmacy counter the shift before. Her winter coat was a man's pea coat from a thrift store on Knickerbocker, 3 sizes too big, sleeves rolled twice, and she told herself the extra room was for layering, which was true in January and a lie by March. At the Aurelian, invisibility had a specific shape. It was Vittorio Cassano, introducing a private room of guests to his sommelier by name, to his chef by name, to the woman who'd designed the flower arrangements by name, and gesturing at the coat room without once looking toward it, saying only, "And check your coats on the way in." It was regulars who'd been coming every Thursday for 2 years, calling her sweetheart, without a single one of them ever once asking what she was called instead. She had stopped noticing the accumulation of it the way you stop noticing an old refrigerator's hum, present always, audible only in the rare silence when it briefly cut out. The pharmacy job had its own particular grind, one that ran on a different clock than the Aurelian's velvet rope hours. Her manager there, a heavyset man named Osei who otherwise treated her decently, had a habit of scheduling her the overnight shift on nights she'd already worked the Aurelian until close, on the theory that a body that had already been standing for 7 hours could presumably stand for 7 more, an arithmetic Nora had stopped arguing with 2 years earlier because arguing cost more energy than the shift itself. She rang up cough syrup and scratch tickets, and, twice a week without fail, a man in his 60s who bought exactly 1 lottery ticket and 1 roll of antacids and never once said a word beyond the total, and she had learned, the way she learned everything, to read the particular quality of his silence. Grief silence, not rudeness silence, the kind that sits in a person's shoulders for years after a specific date, though she'd never once asked him what the date was, because some grids you build for yourself and don't need anyone else to confirm. She rode the J train home most nights, standing the whole way because the seats near the door were always taken by the time her shift ended. One hand wrapped around a pole sticky with other people's commutes, and she had gotten so precise about which car let her out closest to the Knickerbocker stairs that she could have drawn the platform from memory blindfolded. She bought groceries on Sunday mornings at the discount grocer 2 blocks past the bodega, where the manager marked down anything within 3 days of its sell-by date at 6 a.m. sharp, and she had learned the exact 6 a.m. rhythm of that markdown cart the way other women learned a subway schedule, because missing it by 20 minutes meant paying full price for chicken thighs she couldn't actually afford at full price. She did not know, on the Thursday this all started, riding the L train with $1,090 in a zippered pocket and a headache already building behind her left eye, that reading faces for free in an empty coat room was about to become the single most valuable skill in the 5 boroughs. Cigar Smoke and Clove arrived at the private room on the Aurelian's 2nd floor 9 minutes before the entree course, on a man who had never once, in his adult life, raised his voice above a murmur to make a point land. Dominic Castellano, the son of a man everyone still called the Old Man, though he'd been dead 6 years, the inheritor at 29 of an operation that ran shell corporations and construction permits the way other men ran corner stores, did not shout, because he had learned by 17 that a raised voice was a confession of a lost argument, and Dominic Castellano did not lose arguments in rooms he controlled. People who worked for him described the fear the way you'd describe barometric pressure. It was simply present, a weight you felt behind your eyes before you understood why. 6 hours earlier, a man named Felix Amaro, his accountant, the only person alive who held the complete ledger of 11 years of laundered construction contracts in his own head. Unwritten, deliberately unwritten, because Dominic did not trust paper the way he trusted a man's fear of what happened if the man ever wrote anything down, had walked into the Aurelian's second-floor private room for a dinner meant to finalize the handoff of that ledger's contents to a successor accountant, a formality, a retirement dinner in all but name. Felix Amaro had died at the table between the second course and the third of what would later be called, on paper, a cardiac event, and what Dominic Castellano knew within 4 minutes of putting 2 fingers against the man's throat was a targeted poisoning, delivered somewhere inside a room with 14 men in it and 1 working coat-check girl, none of whom had left, none of whom had been searched, all of whom had motive if you looked hard enough, and money if you didn't need to look at all. The 11 years of ledger detail had died with him. That part was catastrophic on its own. The part that was worse, somebody in that locked room had done it on purpose, in front of Dominic Castellano, which meant somebody in that room believed they could get away with murdering a man 3 feet from Dominic's elbow and still walk out the front door by midnight. 7:58 p.m. 6 minutes since Felix Amaro's chair had gone over backward. The room had been locked from the inside at Dominic's word within 90 seconds. A private dining room built with exactly 1 door, on his own specific insistence years earlier, for exactly this kind of contingency, though he'd never once imagined the contingency running in this particular direction. 14 men, none of whom he fully trusted, and 11 of whom he'd have called friends a decade ago, stood in a loose, uneasy ring around a body slumping sideways in a $2,000 chair, and every single one of them had gone quiet in the specific way men go quiet when they're doing math about how fast they could reach a door that wasn't going to open. Dominic Castellano did not care about the police, who would arrive eventually and be handled, the way police arriving at the Aurelian had always, historically, been handled. Dominic Castellano cared about 11 years of ledger, gone, and about the fact that somewhere in a room he controlled, somebody had just proven they were no longer afraid of him. Nobody leaves, nobody touches a phone. His voice didn't rise. It never did. Somebody in this room did this in front of me. I want to know who before the second course goes cold. A man named Renner, mid-50s, silver hair, a construction permit lawyer, who'd been at Dominic's father's funeral 15 years earlier, cleared his throat. "Dominic! It could have been natural!" Felix had a heart. Felix had a heart like a Swiss watch. I had him checked 8 months ago. Personally. Dominic set down the water glass he'd touched exactly once and would not touch again, a habit 3 separate former associates had noted with the specific dread of men cataloguing a predator's tells. Somebody poisoned my accountant at my table in my restaurant, and I am going to find out who before this room stops smelling like clove and starts smelling like a problem that leaves the building on its own. Nobody in that room, for the first 11 minutes, thought to ask the one person in the building who'd had eyes on every single coat, every single pocket, every single hand that had reached into a coat pocket for a phone or a mint or a folded slip of paper for the entire 90 minutes since the first guest had arrived. 47 minutes left, by Dominic's private math, before the head of the city's organized crime task force, a woman who had a standing arrangement with the Aurelian's head of security that guaranteed 45 minutes of official ignorance per incident, a courtesy that was not infinite and was not free, would be legally obligated to walk through that unmarked black door, whether Dominic wanted her to or not. The clock did not exist on any wall in that room. It existed behind Dominic Castellano's sternum, where it had lived, ticking, since he was 17 years old and had first understood that every man he trusted could be measured in minutes before the trust ran out. His empire ran at its foundation on the specific belief that fear was a renewable resource, as long as nobody ever tested whether it had an expiration date. Felix Amaro dying at his own table, in front of 14 men he was supposed to control absolutely, was that test. And somewhere in this locked room, somebody had decided Dominic Castellano's fear had gone stale enough to gamble against. Downstairs, in a coat room the size of a walk-in closet, with a single bare bulb and a rolling rack built for 200 coats, currently holding 141, Nora Kessler had spent the last 6 minutes listening to the ceiling. She'd heard the chair go over. She'd heard, through 8 inches of century-old plaster, the specific fast murmur of 14 men trying to speak quietly and failing, and she'd done what she always did when something upstairs sounded wrong. She'd looked at the small monitor bolted above the coat room door, the one that fed from the single camera covering the second-floor landing, and she'd watched the head of security, a broad, unsmiling man named DeLuca, jog up the stairs 2 at a time with his hand already inside his jacket. She did not know, standing in that closet with a stranger's cashmere overcoat still in her hands, that a man was dead. She knew only that something upstairs had gone the specific kind of quiet that never meant good news, the way she'd known, 3 years running, exactly which combination of silences in a dining room meant a marriage proposal, and which meant a breakup, and which meant somebody was about to walk out without paying, purely from watching 140 faces a week, with nothing better to do with her attention. At 8:11 p.m., the black door at the top of the coat room stairs opened, and DeLuca's voice came down flat and hard. Nobody in or out. Kessler, stay put. She stayed put. It was, she would reflect later, the single easiest instruction anyone had given her all week. At 8:34 p.m., with the task force clock at 11 minutes and dropping, Dominic Castellano came down those stairs himself, which had never once happened in 3 years of Thursday shifts, because the owner of the Aurelian did not visit the coat check, the same way a man doesn't visit his own furnace. Cedar aftershave, cigar smoke, and under it, faint, the specific mineral smell of adrenaline sweat that no cologne fully masks. He stopped in the doorway of the closet-sized room and looked at Nora Kessler the way a man looks at a fire extinguisher he's never once needed before. Every coat that came through this room tonight, you checked all of them? 141. She didn't stop straightening the rack as she said it, because a straight rack was the only thing in the building that was currently hers to control. Why? Somebody in that room upstairs just killed a man. I need to know who had something on them they shouldn't have. A vial, a syringe, anything. She looked at him for the first time directly, which she'd been careful, in 3 years, never to do, because looking directly at a man like Dominic Castellano was the kind of thing that got you noticed, for reasons that were never good. You don't belong here, he said, flat, not cruel exactly, the particular contempt of a man under pressure, aiming it at whatever was closest. Asking questions is my job. Hang the coats. Silence. The kind with a texture, the kind that has weight, the compressor hum kind, that you don't notice until it stops. Nora Kessler set down the cashmere overcoat she was holding, walked to the rack, and pulled out a slim grey wool coat from position 31 out of 141, checked against nothing but memory because she did not use tickets for her own tracking the way the club system did. She used faces, coats, and the order in which they'd arrived, the same grid-holding instinct that had never once been useful to anyone until this exact moment. This one. She held it up. The left interior pocket sat a half-inch heavier than the coat's tailoring accounted for, a detail that would have meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning the specific weight and drape of 140 coats a night, the way other people learn songs. Man who checked this in arrived at 6:52, alone, said he was meeting the Amaro dinner, tipped in a folded 20 instead of loose bills, which nobody does anymore. Folded bills are a habit from a man who's used to handling something he doesn't want creased. And he went to the men's room twice in 90 minutes, which is either a bladder problem or a man checking that something in his pocket hadn't shifted. She reached into the coat's interior pocket and pulled out, between 2 fingers, a slim glass vial, no larger than a lipstick tube, empty, its stopper missing. His name's Reyes, youngest one at your table, sat closest to the door on your accountant's left, and he left 40 minutes ago, before the room locked, because he told your security man he'd gotten a call and had to step out, which means he's not in that room right now getting questioned with everyone else. He's on a subway platform somewhere with a 40-minute head start. Silence. The building settling kind. Dominic Castellano did not say anything for a length of time that would, later, be described by the two men standing behind him on the stairs as the longest they had ever seen him go, without an answer to anything. "Say that again," he said, quiet. Not a question, almost to himself. "I said your killer's name is Reyes. He's had a 40-minute head start, and you're standing in my coat room, asking 141 questions when you should have asked me the first one, 40 minutes ago." She set the empty vial down on the counter between them, with the specific care of a woman who'd handled 140 coats that night and did not intend to start being careless now. "I don't belong here doing your job, Mr. Castellano. I belong here doing mine. Turns out mine was more useful tonight." 14 men upstairs stopped arguing about lawyers and alibis the instant Dominic Castellano walked back into that locked private room, holding a glass vial between two fingers, and said a name that half of them recognized and none of them had thought to say themselves. "Reyes," he said, flat, quiet. "Left the building 40 minutes ago. Told DeLuca he'd gotten a call." A younger man near the window, Reyes's own cousin, as it turned out, though nobody in the room yet knew that detail, went the specific shade of pale that meant a man was recalculating his own proximity to a problem in real time. "How do you know it was him?" Renner asked. "We've been in this room the whole—" The coat check girl found the vial in his pocket and worked out his movements from memory in under 3 minutes. Dominic set the vial down on the white tablecloth next to Felix Amaro's untouched dessert fork, and the small glass object looked, against that much linen and silver, like the smallest and most expensive thing in the room. 20 minutes ago, I told her she didn't belong down there asking questions. I was wrong. Everybody in this room has been wrong about that girl for 3 years. He didn't wait for a response. He had a man named Priest, his head of quiet business, the one who handled things that could not be handled by police or by lawyers, pulled aside within 90 seconds, and by the time the task force liaison finally walked through the unmarked black door at 9:02 p.m., 45 minutes and change since Felix Amaro's chair had gone over, Dominic Castellano was standing calmly at the bar with a glass of water he would not drink, describing, in the same quiet register he used for everything, a tragic cardiac event at dinner, an ambulance already called, a grieving business partner too shaken to speak to press. Nobody mentioned Reyes. Nobody mentioned the vial. That business, Dominic Castellano's business, was already 11 minutes underway by the time the official story finished being told, and it was moving in a direction that had nothing to do with courtrooms. Downstairs, alone again in the coat room with 140 coats and one missing, Nora Kessler put the folded 20 from Reyes's tip jar into the register, exactly as she'd have done with any other night's tips, and did not let herself think too hard about the fact that the last thing that particular $20 bill had touched was a man's hand that had, 90 minutes earlier, uncapped a vial of poison at somebody's dinner table. She clocked out at 1:40 a.m. Her feet hurt in the exact same specific way they hurt every single night. Nothing about the walk to the L train felt different. That, she would think later, was the strangest part of the whole night, that the world kept being exactly as ordinary as it had been that morning, right up until the moment 3 days later when it stopped being ordinary at all. 3 days of silence followed. 400 coats hung and rehung, 2 shifts at the pharmacy counter ringing up cold medicine, and it was in that silence that Nora understood, slowly and without wanting to, that something in her life had shifted position by exactly 1 thread width and wasn't going to shift back. On the 4th day, an envelope arrived at the coat check counter before her shift even started, hand-delivered by a man in a grey suit who didn't give a name, containing $4,000 in cash and a single card with a phone number and nothing else printed on it. She did not call the number. She put the $4,000 toward the rent gap of $460, toward 2 months of Radish's actual vet-recommended food, toward a stove, an actual working stove, delivered and installed within 18 hours of her calling the number listed on a flyer taped to the bodega window, which took less time than Delgado's management company had managed in 14 months, and toward exactly nothing else, because $4,000 felt, for about 6 days, like solving a problem instead of accepting one. It lasted 6 days. On the 7th day, Vittorio Cassano told her, not unkindly, in the flattest voice she'd ever heard him use, that the Aurelian couldn't have that kind of attention around the coat check anymore. Not after task force liaisons had started asking casual, unofficial questions about the staff on shift the night of the cardiac event, and that maybe it was best if she took some time off, unpaid, until things settled. Things settling was Vittorio Cassano's phrase for Nora having no income 4 nights a week. She still had the pharmacy job. The pharmacy job alone did not cover $1,650 in rent, $38 cat food, and a stove she was now making payments on to a man she'd found through a flyer. Friday came. Delgado's management company did not send a person with a clipboard the way Delgado himself might have. They sent a text message, automated, cold, listing a late fee of $75 and a warning about a formal notice at day 30. It did not say eviction. It did not have to. Automated systems rarely bother with warmth, on the theory that warmth costs money and a $75 fee does not. That night, cold, the specific brittle cold of an April that hasn't decided if it's still winter, Nora sat on her mattress with Radish curled against her hip and looked at the business card with no name on it, the one she'd kept in the drawer of her nightstand for 11 days without touching. She thought about the $20 bill that had touched a killer's hand. She thought about 141 coats and the one that had weighed a half-inch heavier than tailoring accounted for. She thought about the specific way Dominic Castellano's voice had gone quiet, not loud, when he'd finally understood what she'd done for him, and the way that quiet had felt different from every other quiet a powerful man had ever aimed in her direction. Before she called, she did what she always did, with a decision that mattered. She laid it out, like a rack of coats, and checked each one against the light. She thought about her mother, 20 years behind the same kind of counter, who had told her once, tired, half-joking, that the only thing worse than being invisible was being seen by the wrong person for the wrong reason. She thought about Vittorio Cassano's flat, unhurried voice, telling her to take some time off, as if time were a gift and not a countdown. She thought about the automated text message that had never once used her name, only an account number, because a company that size didn't need to know her the way a person did in order to take something from her. She thought, too, about the specific quiet Dominic Castellano's voice had gone into on the coat-room stairs, the one that hadn't sounded like every other quiet, powerful man aimed at her. Not contempt, not command, something closer to a man recalculating what a person was worth in real time and not liking how long it had taken him to start. She did not mistake that quiet for kindness. She was careful, turning it over, not to mistake it for anything at all beyond what it actually was. A man who had been wrong about her once and did not enjoy the feeling. She called the number. He picked up on the second ring, the way a man picks up when he's been holding the phone in his hand rather than in his pocket. "I'm in," she said, "but I have terms, all of them, or none of it." "Say them." "I don't touch anything that gets somebody killed directly. I get paid through something legitimate enough that I can explain it to a tax accountant without going to prison. I don't have one. I'll get one. Nobody from your world shows up at my building. I never meet your competition, ever, under any circumstance. And the day I want out, I'm out, clean, and nobody comes to Bushwick to remind me I used to do this." A pause on the line, the kind that had its own gravity. "Done!" Dominic Castellano said. She hung up first. It was the only leverage she had left, and she used it. It felt, that whole first night, like closing her hand around a beautiful trap and choosing, with her eyes fully open, to let the trap close around her fingers anyway. 2 weeks later, they brought her to a private gala at a hotel on Park Avenue that Dominic Castellano's organization quietly owned 3 floors of. A black-tie fundraiser for a children's hospital that existed, Nora understood within an hour of arriving, primarily as a laundering vehicle for 11 separate business interests wearing black tie and pretending to care about pediatric oncology. The air in the ballroom smelled of white lilies, champagne, and, underneath both, the specific ozone smell of 400 wealthy people generating heat and tension in equal measure. because somewhere in that room, according to Dominic's intelligence, sat the man who'd hired Reyes in the first place, a rival named Marchetti Voss, who ran a competing construction interest, and who had, Dominic now believed, engineered Felix Amaro's death specifically to seize the 11 years of ledger knowledge that had died with him, or to prevent Dominic's organization from surviving without it. Nora's job that night was not to check coats. It was to stand at the edge of the room in a black dress that cost more than she'd made in the last 2 months combined, holding a champagne flute she wasn't drinking, and read 400 faces the way she'd once read 140 a night for free. DeLuca stood 12 feet away, radio earpiece invisible under his hair, watching her the way you watch an instrument you don't fully trust yet. Dominic stood across the room in a black tuxedo that had never once, in its life, been wrinkled, working a rope line of donors with the specific charm of a man who had built an entire second personality purely for rooms like this one. At 9:14 p.m., Nora's eyes caught on a man near the dessert table, mid-50s, silver at the temples, laughing at something a donor had said, with the exact half-second delay of a man whose laugh was scheduled rather than felt, and something in her chest went very still, the same stillness she'd felt 3 years' worth of nights, watching a monitor above a coat-room door. She crossed the room without hurrying, the way you cross a room when hurrying would tell 400 people something was wrong, and found DeLuca's shoulder near a service door. Third table from the dessert station, silver hair, navy tux, talking to the woman in emerald. She kept her voice at the exact volume of a woman discussing canapes. He's not laughing at the joke, he's laughing on a 2-count delay, which means he's translating something in his head before he reacts to it, which means English isn't the language he's actually thinking in tonight, which means he's rehearsed this room in a different language and is running it through a second pass in real time. Nobody does that unless they're managing something they can't afford to get wrong in front of witnesses. That's Alderman Cho's chief of staff. That's a man wearing somebody else's face for the night. Get me 5 more minutes and I'll tell you whose. DeLuca did not question her again. In 2 weeks, he'd learned the specific cost of questioning her the first 2 times and being wrong both times. Nora drifted closer, closer still, until she was near enough to catch, under the lilies and champagne, a thread of cologne she recognized, not from that night, but from a coat. A slim grey wool coat, position 31 out of 141. The coat a man named Reyes had checked into her closet 3 weeks earlier, with a vial in the pocket and a folded 20 in his hand. It wasn't the same man. It was the same cologne, applied by the same hand that had bought it, most likely. For both of them, the specific signature of a man who outfitted his people the way other men outfitted a fleet of cars. He's not Cho's chief of staff tonight, she told DeLuca, quiet, flat. He's wearing Cho's chief of staff like a coat. Whoever dressed Reyes for that dinner 3 weeks ago dressed this man for tonight. Same cologne, same tailor's stitch on the lapel. I hung 400 versions of that exact stitch a week for 3 years. I know a house tailor's hand the way you know your own signature. Marchetti Voss has a tailor on retainer who dresses his whole crew identically so nobody can tell his enforcers from his executives at a glance. That's not a chief of staff. That's a man here to finish what Reyes started. Silence. The kind with weight. Dominic Castellano crossed the ballroom floor in 11 seconds flat. His men would count it later, the way you count anything about a man like him that's never happened before. And by the time he reached the dessert table, the man in the navy tux had already clocked something wrong in the room's rhythm and was moving, unhurried, toward a service exit that fed. Nora happened to know from the building's floor plan DeLuca had shown her that afternoon, directly into a stairwell that led to the loading dock. Boss said, "Think it over," the man had said to Reyes, 3 weeks earlier and 4 boroughs away. Though Nora hadn't been there to hear it, she'd only pieced it together from the pattern, the same way she pieced together everything, the specific, consistent, almost right of a man executing somebody else's plan and not entirely trusting his own nerve to finish it. Dominic did not raise his voice across that crowded ballroom, because raising his voice in front of 400 witnesses and 11 donor cameras was the single worst thing a man in his position could do. He simply changed direction, smoothly, the way a shark changes direction. and two of his men peeled off from the rope line without appearing to hurry at all, and the man in the navy tux was intercepted at the service door with the specific, quiet efficiency of men who had done this exact motion in this exact hallway more than once before. "Take him downstairs," Dominic said. Flat, almost bored. The same register he'd have used to order dessert. "Wait!" Nora's voice didn't rise either, but something in it made DeLuca actually stop moving. "What does downstairs mean, specifically, in this building?" Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did something it had apparently not done in front of witnesses in longer than anyone in that ballroom could remember, which was hesitate. "It means Marchetti Voss finds out, within the hour, that sending a man to finish Reyes's work costs him that man." His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone careful, the tone of a man measuring a woman he had started, against every instinct that had kept him alive for 12 years, to actually take seriously. "That's all you need tonight. That's not an answer. That's the same sentence wearing a different tuxedo. You told me your terms 3 weeks ago. I don't touch anything that gets somebody killed directly, you said. You haven't touched anything tonight. I have. That's the arrangement you asked for." She didn't have an answer for that. She picked up a fresh champagne flute from a passing tray, mostly for something to hold, and watched from across the room as the man in the navy tux was walked, calmly, unremarkably, out through a service door that 400 wealthy donors never once looked twice at, because a hotel service door swallowing a man in a tuxedo was, in a room like that, the single least interesting thing that could happen. Rain arrived by midnight, the fine cold kind that doesn't so much fall as hang in the air like it's deciding, and it was in that hanging rain that Dominic Castellano found Nora Kessler sitting on the loading dock steps behind the hotel's service entrance, coat pulled tight, not crying, just still, in the specific way of someone doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. He sat down beside her, not close, close enough. "Scotch," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a flask he'd produced from somewhere inside his tuxedo jacket, along with 2 glass tumblers that would have looked at home on any board table in the city. "I don't drink on shift." "You're not on shift. Your shift ended when DeLuca walked that man out the door. He poured anyway, 1 glass, set it near her hand, didn't push it further. You get used to needing something for your hands to do, after." She looked at the glass. She looked at his hands. No rings, a thin white scar across 2 knuckles, the specific stillness of hands that had learned, a long time ago, never to shake in front of anyone. She thought of her own hands, calloused from 3 years of coat hangers, and realized she was looking at a man whose hands told the same kind of truth hers did, just for a different trade entirely. "What happened to your knuckle?" she said. Silence. The kind with texture. "My father put a gun on a table in front of me when I was 17 and told me to use it or spend the rest of my life explaining to men twice my age why I hadn't." A pause. "I used it. I've had a clock in my chest ever since, telling me how many minutes I've got before the next table." She took the scotch. She didn't drink it right away, just held the glass the way she held a coat before hanging it, a moment of respect for what was about to change hands. "My mother worked coat check before me," she said. "Same club, different owner, 20 years back. She used to say the whole job was standing in a doorway watching other people's evenings happen to them. I told myself for years I'd get out, before it became my whole life too. Then I looked up, and it was my whole life, and nobody in 3 years had ever once asked me what I actually saw standing in that doorway." He reached over, slowly enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, and touched the burn scar on her left wrist, the dime-sized mark from the curling iron, a mark she'd stopped noticing years ago, the way you stop noticing your own name. "What's this from?" "Being careless once, at 26, in a rush. Nobody died when I got it wrong. Difference between you and me. A small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You've got a knuckle, I've got a wrist. Same math, smaller stakes." His thumb stayed on the scar a second longer than either of them needed for the sentence to make sense. Neither of them moved away first. The rain hung. Somewhere behind them, past the loading dock, a car door closed twice, and neither of them looked toward that sound, by unspoken and total agreement. "I grew up 4 blocks from where you did," he said. "Different side of the tracks on the same street." "I know," she said. "I could smell it on you the first night, under the cigar smoke. Cedar and clove don't cover that all the way up, no matter how good your tailor is." "You could have told DeLuca to just call the police tonight," she said. After a while, the rain still hanging, neither of them moving to leave the wet steps. "Instead, you had 2 men and a phrase. That's a choice, not a habit you fell into. It's both." He turned the tumbler slowly between 2 fingers, not drinking, the same way she wasn't. "A habit you choose enough times stops feeling like a choice. I stopped noticing the difference somewhere around the time you were reading faces above a coat-room door for free." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Compare us like we're the same kind of tired. You chose your clock, at 17, with a gun already on the table in front of you. I inherited mine at 19, in a library, teaching myself to read faces because nobody in my actual life had ever once looked at mine long enough to explain what any of it meant." She finally took a sip of the scotch, grimaced. It burned exactly the way she'd expected, the way anything worth being careful about burns, and set the tumbler down harder than she meant to. "Nobody handed me a gun and asked me to choose. Nobody's ever handed me anything. I built the only thing I have entirely by myself, in the dark, for free, and then a man who didn't know my name told me I didn't belong in a room where it turned out I was the only person who did. I'm handing you something now. You're handing me a job that pays better than the one where a stranger called me sweetheart for 2 years running. That's not the same as being handed something. That's a transaction, and I know the difference, same as you do." But she said it without heat, and they both heard the difference between that sentence and the one she'd have said on the loading dock 3 weeks earlier, on the night the first envelope arrived, when every door had still been open behind her. He reached over again, not sudden, not asking permission with his eyes the way men did in movies, just slow enough that stopping him would have been easy, and she didn't do it. And this time, it wasn't the scar on her wrist. It was 2 fingers, lightly, against the calluses across her palm, the hard ridges 3 years of coat hangers had built there. "This is the part of you that named Reyes in under 3 minutes, he said. "Not the dress, not the room, this. That's the most honest thing you've said to me since the coat room. I don't say honest things often. It's bad for the clock." She almost laughed. It came out instead as something quieter, something that sat in her chest, next to the hammering that had started the moment his fingers touched hers and hadn't stopped since. A thing she would not, could not, name out loud, because naming it felt like the first stitch of a pattern she couldn't afford to start pulling loose again once it caught. They sat like that until the scotch went warm in the glass, and neither of them had taken more than 1 sip, and nothing else happened, which was, somehow, the loudest thing that had happened between them yet. Somewhere past 1 in the morning, a car idled at the curb waiting to take her home, its headlights cutting a slow gold line across the wet steps, and Dominic Castellano stood when she stood, the way men in his world rarely bothered to for anyone who wasn't a donor or a judge. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to. She'd already noticed, 3 weeks in, that he only ever touched her when there was something specific to say with it. Never as a reflex. Never as a habit borrowed from somewhere else. And that restraint had started to mean more to her than she was willing to examine too closely at 1 in the morning on a wet loading dock. "Same time tomorrow," he said, which was as close as a man like him came to asking whether she'd still be there. "I've got a shift at the pharmacy at 6, she said. "Some of us still have 2 jobs, Mr. Castellano. Not for much longer." "Don't," she said, but there wasn't much heat left in it by then, and they both heard that too. 3 nights later, in a warehouse near the rail yards that Dominic's organization used for meetings that never happened on paper, Nora Kessler stood in front of a folding table with 6 men's coats laid out flat under a work lamp, recovered, quietly, from a raid on one of Marchetti Voss's storage properties, coats belonging to men whose loyalties Dominic needed sorted before a shipment of concrete contract paperwork, worth an amount Nora had stopped letting herself calculate, changed hands at dawn. The warehouse smelled of diesel, and, underneath it, the specific mildewed sweetness of cardboard that had sat too long near a leaking roof, a smell that would follow this particular job for the rest of her life, in the way certain smells follow you. Priest hovered near the door, arms crossed, watching her the way a man watches a tool he isn't sure he trusts yet. DeLuca stood closer, closer than he'd stood the first week, which she'd noticed, and filed away without comment, because trust in this world was measured in inches of proximity rather than in words. She had asked, on the drive over, exactly how much time she'd have, and Dominic had told her, flat, that it depended entirely on how fast Voss's people moved once they realized their depot had been raided, which meant the honest answer was somewhere between an hour and no time at all. She had nodded and said nothing else, because she had learned, in 3 weeks, that asking a dangerous man to promise a specific number of minutes was like asking a subway platform to promise a specific train. She worked the coats in order, the same rhythm she'd used on 140 a night for 3 years, running her fingers along collars and cuffs and linings, checking stitch tension against stitch tension the way she'd once checked one man's tailor against another's, without a single tag or label to guide her, purely from 3 years of feeling the difference between a house cut and an off-the-rack seam under her own hands. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket, a text from Delgado's management company. Late fee waived. Account current. Reference #4471. She had asked for exactly none of that. She knew precisely who. She finished checking the 6th coat's inner lining with 2 fingers, felt the specific give of a seam that had been resewn recently by hands less practiced than a house tailor's, and looked up at Dominic Castellano in the flat work lamp light with the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood, all the way down, that there is no clean door out of this room anymore, and hasn't been since a folded $20 bill went into her register 3 weeks ago. This coat's been resewn along the inner seam in the last 2 weeks, she said. Somebody's carrying something they didn't want found in a pocket, and they had it moved into the lining instead, which is either very smart or very desperate, depending on whether they did it themselves or whether somebody made them. She traced the seam once more with her nail. Whoever wears this coat isn't your traitor. He's your traitor's insurance policy. You go after the wrong one. The real one disappears with everything he's holding by morning. Behind her, a man near the warehouse door, young, nervous, knew enough that his shoes still had the shine of a purchase rather than a habit, took a call on a cheap phone, and went the specific shade of pale that dropped the whole room's temperature 2 degrees before he'd said a single word into it. Voss's people are already moving on the rail yard depot, he said. Now. Not tonight. Now. Dominic Castellano did not raise his voice. He never did. But something in the room changed anyway, the way air changes, right before a storm actually breaks, instead of just threatening to. How many minutes? He said, and everyone in the room understood he wasn't asking about minutes in any calendar sense. He was asking about the clock behind his sternum, the one that had been running alone since he was 17, the one that had just started running for 2 people instead of 1. 20, the young man said. Maybe less. Nora Kessler looked at the 6 coats laid out flat under the work lamp, at the one with the poorly resewn seam that meant somebody's insurance policy was about to walk out that warehouse door in the next 20 minutes and disappear for good, and understood, with the specific, clean, cold clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years reading rooms nobody thought to ask her about, that there was no version of the next 20 minutes where she wasn't the one who had to be in that rail yard herself. You need somebody who can tell which one of Voss's men is carrying the actual ledger and which one's just wearing the coat that says so, she said. Not somebody who grabs the first 6 people and hopes. No, Dominic said. Flat. Immediate. The fastest he had answered anything since the loading dock. That's not a negotiation this time. That's just true. She was already folding the resewn coat over one arm, the same practiced motion she'd used on 400 coats a night for 3 years. You go in wrong, you grab the insurance policy, and the real ledger walks. I'm the only person in this building who's touched every one of these seams with my own hands. You wanted somebody who reads a room. This is the part where that stops being a metaphor. Dominic Castellano looked at her the way, she understood now, he had never once looked at anyone in that warehouse, at anyone at the gala, at anyone at all who wasn't a threat or a tool. "You're the only person alive who could have told me that," he said. Nora Kessler picked up her bag, checked the time on her phone, and said, flat, deadpan, the specific dry understatement of a woman whose whole life had trained her never to let a room see what a thing actually cost her. "Great. I've also got a cat at home who eats at 11 sharp and does not care about your ledger, so whatever we're about to do, let's do it fast." Nora Kessler did not become a legend behind the coat check counter. She became a woman who kept the lights on, who paid a stove off in 6 installments instead of 18, and who still, some nights, stood in an ordinary doorway, watching an ordinary room and reading faces out of a habit that had never once stopped belonging entirely to her. She had named a killer in under 3 minutes, in a room where 20 men with badges and guns and titles had failed to notice a vial in a coat pocket. She had told a dangerous man no, and then yes on her own terms, with her eyes open the whole way down. Whether that made her the smartest woman on Ludlow Street or the newest name on a list of people who thought they could hold a beautiful trap at arm's length, that part, even she couldn't have told you yet. Nora Kessler and Dominic Castellano are now standing 20 minutes from a rail yard that might already be empty by the time they get there. Will her eye for the smallest detail be enough to catch a ledger walking out the door disguised as somebody else's coat? And now that Dominic Castellano has finally let himself hesitate over something other than money, does that hesitation protect her, or does it become the first loose thread that unravels both of them? Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. If you liked this one, hit like, share it with somebody who needs a good story tonight, and subscribe with the bell so you don't miss the next chapter.